The Mongol Empire didn't collapse in battle. It collapsed on horseback, still winning wars, still collecting tribute, still terrifying continents, while quietly losing the ability to hold itself together. That sounds wrong until you look at the timeline. Because in the 13th century, Mongol armies were still pushing into new territories, still enforcing fear through speed and coordination that most states simply couldn't match. Yet by the time the 14th century arrived, the empire was already fragmenting into khanates that barely recognized each other. Expansion continued in one direction, while coherence dissolved in another. And here's the pressure point most people miss. This wasn't just political decay, it was structural. The Mongols built an empire optimized for movement, horse relay systems, seasonal mobility, decentralized command across vast steppe corridors. That system worked brilliantly for conquest. It worked far less brilliantly for administration. Because once you stop moving and start governing, you need something the Mongols never fully built at scale: institutional gravity. Meanwhile, in the background of this fragmentation, something almost absurd is happening in China. Local warlords, tax collectors, and surviving imperial administrators are trying to stitch order back together from the ruins of Yuan control. Among them is a man who started life in conditions so poor he wasn't even inside the system. No status, no lineage, no protection. A former beggar, if you strip away the polite language of later histories. He would eventually become Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming Dynasty. But at this point, he's just another actor in a collapsing imperial space, watching a foreign ruling system weaken from the inside out. The tension is not that the Mongols are being defeated outright, it's that they are being outlasted, out-administered, out-organized, by people who never matched them in open field warfare, but didn't need to. And this is where the anger starts to build, because empires rarely die in the way their founders imagine. They don't get defeated, they degrade. They lose alignment between what they are good at and what the world now requires from them. A system designed for fast conquest doesn't automatically convert into one that can manage famine relief, taxation stability, or bureaucratic continuity. And the Mongols never fully solved that translation problem. We'll come back to that gap, the one between riding across continents and governing them, because it explains everything that follows. The real question isn't how the Mongols conquered half the known world, it's how long any empire can survive when its original advantage stops working. My read is this: the Mongols didn't fall because they became weak, but because they never stopped being what made them strong in the first place. But I'm not fully certain the collapse was inevitable. There are moments where coordination still held, just barely, and those moments matter more than history usually admits. My prediction is simple. Once we trace this properly, the Mongol Empire stops looking like a sudden collapse and starts looking like a system slowly exceeding its own design limits. And the man once dismissed as nothing more than a beggar will look like something far more uncomfortable, a beneficiary of imperial overreach. The Mongols didn't just ride out of the steppe and conquer lands. That phrasing flattens what was actually a highly engineered system of movement. At its core was a logistics network that most settled states of the 13th century simply couldn't replicate. Take the Yam system. Relay stations placed across thousands of kilometers, fresh horses waiting every 30 to 40 miles, riders swapping mounts and carrying orders faster than any conventional courier system in Eurasia. A message could move from Karakoram to the western frontiers of the empire in days, sometimes less than a week depending on conditions. For its time, that was almost orbital communication speed compared to the medieval norm. But here's where the tension starts to show. That same system, which made conquest effortless, also locked the empire into a specific rhythm: movement, extraction, expansion. It was not designed for the slow violence of governance, tax harmonization, legal standardization, agricultural stabilization. Those require something the Mongols never fully built at scale, a permanent administrative class with unified incentives. Instead, they inherited bureaucracies rather than constructing a single one. In China, they leaned on remnants of Song administration, but placed Mongol elites above them. In Persia, they tolerated local Persian bureaucrats while extracting revenue through Mongol overseers. In the Russian principalities, they ruled indirectly through tribute systems that minimized administrative overhead but maximized resentment. It worked until it didn't, because every layer of delegation introduced drift. Orders interpreted differently, tax systems adjusted locally, loyalty fractured along regional lines. And while the empire looked unified on maps, on the ground it was becoming a network of semi-independent extraction zones, connected more by fear than by shared structure. There's a moment in the Yuan Dynasty, Mongol rule in China, where this tension becomes visible in the fiscal records. Grain tax fluctuations in the 1280s and 1290s show increasingly inconsistent collection rates across provinces. Some regions are still functioning efficiently. Others are slipping into local autonomy, withholding revenue, or simply misreporting output. Not rebellion yet, something quieter, administrative decay. And then there's the court itself. Khan succession becomes less about strategic continuity and more about factional survival. After Kublai Khan, the Yuan court doesn't just weaken, it begins competing with itself. Competing factions within the Mongol elite start prioritizing internal positioning over imperial cohesion. That shift matters more than any battlefield loss, because once the center stops acting like a center, the periphery stops behaving like an empire. Meanwhile, across the fractured landscape of southern China, local power structures begin to reemerge. Not unified resistance, something more fragmented. Religious movements, peasant uprisings, local militias. Among them, a man who had once been a wandering orphan and temple servant is quietly learning something the Mongol system never fully mastered: how to convert local legitimacy into sustained control. Zhu Yuanzhang isn't powerful yet, but he is learning the real weakness of the empire he is living inside of. And here's the uncomfortable realization forming in the background. The Mongols never lost a single defining battle that ended their empire. There is no Waterloo moment here. What they lose instead is alignment between center and periphery, between extraction and governance, between speed and stability. That's the structural fault line widening under them. We'll get to how that fault line turns into full collapse and how someone with no birth status manages to step directly into the vacuum it creates. But first, there's a detail most histories skip. The empire didn't just weaken politically. It started losing confidence in its own communication lines. And once that happens, everything else accelerates. By the early 14th century, something strange is visible if you stop looking at battles and start looking at paperwork. The Yuan court in Dadu, modern Beijing, is still issuing edicts like it governs a unified empire. But those edicts are arriving into regions that no longer respond in the same way. Some provinces comply out of habit, others comply selectively, and some simply delay until enforcement becomes impossible. This is the point where empires usually fail quietly first, then loudly later, and the Mongols are now dealing with a problem they never had to solve during conquest: trust. Not trust between individuals, trust between center and periphery. Tax quotas only work if local administrators believe the center can enforce consequences. Military orders only matter if commanders believe reinforcements will actually arrive. Once that belief starts to decay, the system doesn't need to be destroyed from outside. It starts dissolving from within its own expectations. There's a recorded spike in paper currency instability during this period. The Yuan paper money system, initially innovative and tightly controlled, begins to lose credibility outside core regions. Inflation isn't just economic here, it's political. When currency stops being trusted, it's not just prices that shift, it's authority. And while the empire is dealing with this slow internal drift, environmental pressure enters the system almost like a final stress test. The 1340s bring a combination of floods, famine, and disease across North China. River systems change course. Agricultural output drops. Local administrations, already weakened, struggle to respond. The result isn't immediate collapse, it's compounding failure. Each crisis makes the next one harder to manage. Now, this is where the Mongol system's original strength turns against it again. A decentralized empire is flexible in expansion. But in crisis, decentralization becomes fragmentation. Local officials begin prioritizing survival over compliance. Bandit groups form not just from desperation, but from opportunity. Some are former soldiers, some are tax collectors who simply stopped forwarding revenue. The line between governance and predation starts to disappear. And in this environment, Zhu Yuanzhang begins to rise. He is not born into power. He doesn't inherit networks. Early on, he actually joins a Buddhist monastery during famine conditions, not as a spiritual pursuit, but as survival. Later, he drifts into rebel groups operating in the Yangtze region. What distinguishes him is not ideology, it's discipline. While other rebel leaders raid and disperse, he begins consolidating territory, enforcing taxation, and building administrative continuity inside chaos. That detail matters more than it sounds, because at this stage, the Mongol state is still militarily formidable. If you look purely at cavalry strength or battlefield capacity, the Yuan dynasty is not yet a defeated power. But it is increasingly unable to convert military strength into political stability. And that gap between force and control is where history starts to tilt. There's a moment in some Yuan records that feels almost understated. Officials reporting difficulty moving grain supplies, not because of enemy armies, but because local intermediaries refuse cooperation unless paid extra or guaranteed protection. It's bureaucratic bargaining inside a system that no longer commands obedience automatically. And this is the reversal point most people miss. The Mongol Empire doesn't lose its territory first. It loses the assumption that its commands will be followed. Once that assumption breaks, everything else becomes logistical cleanup. Zhu Yuanzhang is operating inside that cleanup zone. He's not defeating an intact empire. He's selecting from its fragments. And I'm not fully convinced the Yuan collapse was purely inevitable at this stage. There are moments, failed reforms, aborted centralization attempts, where stronger coordination might have slowed the fragmentation. But each attempt arrives slightly too late and slightly too weak. My prediction here is simple. By the time we reach the final phase, the Mongol Empire will look less like a fallen superpower and more like a network that stopped believing in its own signals. There's a habit in how this story gets told that quietly distorts everything. The Mongols get framed as an empire that fell to rebellions, as if there was a final moment where armies met, a decisive break, a clear ending. But if you look at the sequence of events in the 1350s, what you actually see is something less cinematic and more uncomfortable. Administrative authority migrating away from the Yuan state faster than military defeat ever arrives. The court in Dadu is still issuing commands, still collecting in some regions, still maintaining the language of sovereignty. But in the Yangtze Basin, Zhu Yuanzhang is already doing something structurally different. He is building a parallel state that doesn't rely on inherited Mongol legitimacy or steppe aristocracy. It relies on enforcement that works locally, consistently, and predictably. And that distinction is everything. Because empires don't survive on power alone. They survive on predictability. Zhu understands this in a way the Yuan court increasingly doesn't. His forces begin standardizing grain collection, stabilizing local taxation, and most importantly, ensuring that orders issued today look the same when enforced next month. That sounds basic. It isn't. It is exactly what the Mongol system, optimized for mobility and delegation, had begun to lose. There's a key campaign in the 1360s that illustrates the shift. Zhu's forces are not simply winning battles against rival warlords or remnants of Yuan authority. They are absorbing administrative capacity, tax registers, local officials, supply routes. Each conquest is less about territory and more about converting fragmented governance into a single operating system. Meanwhile, the Mongol court is fighting a different problem entirely: coherence. Regional commanders act with increasing independence. Communication delays stretch decisions beyond usefulness. And when central authority tries to reassert control, it often arrives after local realities have already changed. By the time orders arrive, the situation they were designed for no longer exists. That gap is fatal. And here's the uncomfortable reversal. The Mongols built an empire that could conquer continents faster than any system before it, but they never built one that could update itself slowly without breaking. Zhu Yuanzhang exploits that exactly. By 1368, when he establishes the Ming Dynasty and takes Dadu, it is not the end of Mongol military capacity in a dramatic sense. It is the end of Mongol administrative relevance in North China. The Yuan court retreats not because it has been erased everywhere, but because it can no longer meaningfully govern the core it once depended on. And from there, the empire doesn't so much collapse as evaporate outward into successor khanates and regional powers that still carry Mongol lineage, but not Mongol unity. Now, the prediction that matters most is this. If you strip away the romanticized version of Mongol conquest, what remains is a warning about system design. Speed without institutional depth creates expansion that outpaces control. And once control fractures, even the most dominant military structure becomes reactive instead of directive. I'm not fully convinced this outcome was mathematically inevitable. There were brief windows, especially under stronger centralized coordination, where a different administrative architecture might have slowed fragmentation. But those windows close quietly, and no empire notices the exact moment it stops being able to govern at scale. My prediction is simple. Future empires won't fall because they are beaten. They will fall because they remain optimized for the world they already conquered, not the one they are currently trying to hold. And that's the part that should make anyone uncomfortable looking at the Mongols. Not how they expanded, but how little their system changed while the world underneath them did.